The latest from 7 News with Michael Usher.
Good evening and welcome to the latest on Vladimir Putin's grip on power. Tonight we're examining the Russian president's leadership as his invasion of Ukraine stalls. Ukraine's intelligence agency has claimed Putin's days in the top job could be numbered. The country's chief directorate of intelligence posted that a group of influential Russian elite are plotting to remove him from power. For Kremlin insiders, it's unclear if that's the view of a minority at this stage, but the stuttering Ukraine invasion is proving to be a failure for Putin, which, along with fierce sanctions from the West, will no doubt be adding to pressure on his command. A UK report suggests that if he's ousted, a likely successor to Putin could be Alexander Bortnikov. He's the head of Russia's spy agency, the FSB, and like Putin, also a former KGB agent. Let's first go to Jeff Parry, our correspondent in Lviv, for the latest on the ground there. Jeff, good evening to you from here. Now, the US defence officials, they say Russian forces are, quote, struggling on many fronts in this war. Is that true?
Well, Michael, everyone's saying it. The analysts are saying it. The intelligence agencies, all of them are saying it. World leaders are saying it, that Vladimir Putin has bitten off more than he can chew. And if you look around Ukraine today, there's some activity going on in Mariupol and some fighting there, and they're making advances. But elsewhere, they just seem to be stuck. If you look at Kyiv itself, I mean, we've had that convoy now for weeks surrounding or coming down towards the city to surround it, but they haven't been able to. It would explain why that the Russian troops are now digging trenches and laying minefields, that they're taking up defensive positions. The supply lines are stretched. They're running short of fuel. They're running short of food. They're having trouble getting ammunition through to the troops. They're pretty much stuck. So seems to be that the tactic is to sit down, just blast away at the city and hold your ground. And it might also explain these latest claims that there are about 15,000 Belarusian troops who are in the next day or two will cross the border and come down and join those Russian soldiers in that siege of Kyiv, which isn't really a siege. They just happen to be there and they're just taking pot shots at the city, Michael.
What about Mariupol? Because that's not a siege. I mean, that is a city being bombarded and slowly destroyed bit by bit. What is happening there?
Yeah, and what a human tragedy this is. I mean, you've now got President Zelensky describing or comparing what's happening to Mariupol as Armageddon. There's so little left of it that he says it pretty much doesn't exist now. Some 90% of Mariupol has been bombed to rubble. There's still 300,000 people living there. That's hard to understand, you know, how they're surviving. But this is the Russian tactic, pretty much just to carpet bomb the whole city. You just look at the civilian areas and what they're targeting. Churches, schools with people under them, a theatre with 1,000 people under them, maternity hospitals, which they say is fake news but turns out to be very real. This is the sort of attitude that they're taking to Mariupol and which they may very well turn to other cities in Ukraine, Michael.
And what about this sort of pretty lethal threat of Russia to refusing to rule out using a devastating option in its pretty extensive arsenal?
Yeah, well, we've got NATO meeting tomorrow and US President Biden is on his way to Brussels to take part in talks with NATO partners. Look, they'll discuss the nuclear issue. They'll also discuss the likelihood, and they're convinced that Russia will use chemical and biological weapons in Ukraine. But the nuclear question is a very interesting one because now you've got Russia saying, well, you know, it's still on the table and we'll use it if we're threatened. But what if they decide to use a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield just in Ukraine? What does NATO do then? How do they respond then? They've just said that we'll defend every inch of NATO, every member country is safe, but, you know, they'll only go so far as Ukraine is concerned. So if he uses a nuclear weapon there, you know, how does NATO respond? There are all these questions, and they're very serious questions for the future of Europe and probably for the future of the world that will be discussed at that NATO meeting tomorrow, Michael.
It's terrifying. All right, Jeff Parry in Lviv for us tonight. Thank you. Joining me now is one of Australia's top security and intelligence minds, former director of the Defence Intelligence Organisation and ANU Emeritus Professor Paul Dibb. Professor, thanks for your time on the latest tonight.
My pleasure.
Now, the claims of a potential coup against Putin, they've come from Ukrainian intelligence, we understand. In your opinion, how legitimate do you think they are?
Look, I raised my eyebrows straight away because if you're a Ukrainian and you've really got some inside information there could be a coup, you'd be better off shutting up. because you don't want to warn Putin. That's the first point. I'm not doubting it, but, we'll have to see. To overthrow Putin, you've got to have two options. One is massive popular demonstrations, and you've seen how already Putin's police are so oppressive in putting that down. With regard to him, in the old Soviet Union, a place you may remember, it had a thing called the Politburo, the political bureau, what you and I would call a cabinet of ministers. And they got rid of Khrushchev, becoming increasingly unstable in his threats to bury the West with nuclear weapons. And while he was away on holiday in guess where, the Crimea, they voted him out. And when he came back, you're no longer General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. That's the first example. The second one was a failed coup. Again, you may remember more recently. This was August 91. Gorbachev was still in power. He was on holiday down in Crimea. And they had a meeting of the coup leaders. And they were the head of the KGB, that is the National Intelligence Service, very famous, if not infamous, the Minister for Defense, he who commanded forces, and two other ministers. And that coup failed because they didn't get their act together and get all the military on side. Putin has a military organization that he invented. In Russian, it's called Rosgvardia, the Russian Guard. What does it do? Well, it does some internal security, border security stuff, but its main purpose is to be loyal to its commander-in-chief. And guess who that is? Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. And how big is this National Guard? How about 340,000? So if you're going to run a coup, you better get all the ducks lined up, because if he gets a smell of this, he'll terminate the coup leaders.
Well, what that raises then is the interesting scenario, as you describe it, of almost a wall of steel around Putin. I guess the more pointed question is a coup potential? Is it even possible in the way that Russia is run right now and the way Putin has set up that ring of steel around him?
That's a good phrase, by the way. I might use it with your permission, ring of steel. Yeah. Look, what I'm about to say to you, I hope I'm terribly wrong. Not for the first time, by the way. He has gathered around him a bunch of yes men, they're mainly men, by the way, of ex-KGB intelligence backgrounds and military. They tell him exactly what he wants to hear. In other words, this man is drinking his own bathwater, and at this potentially very dangerous time, which could escalate into the Third World War, there's nobody there that I'm aware of that could say, with respect, President, what you're doing is wrong. Now, his chief of military, Shoigu, first of all, he's not a Russian, he's from one of the Siberian tribes on the Chinese border. More importantly, his previous job was in charge of state emergencies. Well, that's hardly a battle-hardened minister for defense, is it?
No.
So the trouble is, look, and I'm no psychologist, when you look at Putin, and it's on your screen right now, he's increasingly puffy in the face. On a current standard, certainly on mine, by the way, he's not all that old, 69, but he's increasingly isolating himself from other people. You've seen the famous shot of him meeting the president of France, Macron, on a table. I can't imagine how long was it. Was it 50 meters? It looked more like 100 meters. When did you see at 5 in the morning of the 24th of February, when he effectively declared war, which of course he didn't. He just said there would be a special military operation. He had his National Security Council, and his chief of intelligence, he asked him to get up and say something. And this poor person, who was clearly shaking, before he could get a few words out, Putin says, "That's rubbish, get out of the way." And that's how he treats people. Yeah. So this man, I think, look, if I was to guess psychologically, is increasingly isolated and paranoid, and this is very dangerous.
It is dangerous, but I wonder then if we've been talking in the context of a political coup around him, obviously what the Ukrainians are speculating, which might just be wishful thinking as much as anything, but what's the potential of people power, of a revolution? I mean, Putin is a strong leader, but he, is leading through questionable elections and tyrannical in style, dictatorship in style. What's the potential of the people rising up and saying, hang on, we've had enough of this?
70% of Russians who are out there, particularly older people in rural, backward Siberia, where the only information they get is totally government controlled.
Just one last point on these oligarchs, these puffed up oligarchs who've scrambled their private jets and their luxury ships to all corners of the globe right now. Do they really have any influence over the Kremlin, over Putin's thinking, and are they really hurting? I mean, these sanctions that we're all taking some comfort in, that they're being hurt, but do they have any effect at all on Putin?
I was in Moscow 5 years ago when the sanctions were imposed for Crimea and the Donbass. And it was a vibrant modern city, five-star restaurants, five-star hotels, all that sort of stuff. So I was a bit cynical when these sanctions were first announced, but these ones the world has seen nothing like. And by the way, China, Xi Jinping had better sit up and take notice that the West, which he always derives, along with his mate Putin, that the West has got its act together in a real way. And it's the West that controls international finance. And I know you and your listeners are well across things like the SWIFT and the fact that, he's got $700 billion US in foreign exchange reserves. I thought that would be his treasury chest in the face of sanctions. Well, I got that one wrong because he can't move most of that figure.
All right, so they are having an impact, which is interesting. It's good to talk to you, Professor Paul Dibb. Lovely to have a chat to you about this and your knowledge. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Vladimir Putin's most vocal critic, Alexei Navalny, has been found guilty of large-scale fraud in a Russian court. The country's opposition leader was sentenced to 9 years in a maximum security prison in a case he says is politically motivated. He was already serving a 2.5-year sentence for apparent parole violations. Navalny returned to Russia last year after surviving a poison attack. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has triggered a humanitarian crisis as millions of people flee to neighbouring countries and beyond. Let's go now to Australian nurse Kate White, who's running the Doctors Without Borders emergency response to the crisis from Geneva. Kate, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Now, look, your teams are very busy on the ground right now and front line in Ukraine. Let's talk about the casualties. What are they seeing in terms of numbers and the severity of them?
So right now, in terms of numbers, it's dramatically different across the country. So at the moment, the eastern part of the country is the most impacted. They are seeing hospitals that are overwhelmed with patients, not only from a trauma perspective, but also from the perspective of people who have hypertension, diabetes, epilepsy, and are seeing an exasperation of their illness because they're no longer able to access healthcare because so many hospitals and health facilities are no longer functional. I
want to talk to you about that in depth in a few questions' time as well, about the other conditions that people would be facing. But just that town or the area of Mariupol, I mean, how dire is it on the ground there? And your people must be in some danger as well.
It's been extremely dire. So we had existing programs in Mariupol before the escalation of this conflict on the 24th of February. We had contact with our staff up until a week ago. And what they were telling us in terms of what they were experiencing on ground was horrific. No water, no electricity, no ability to heat buildings, having to collect what little sort of wood and other things that they could to burn to be able to cook because their accommodation was not equipped with, a modern day kitchen is not really used to burning firewood to be able to cook. And then no food available on the market, and seeing really horrific things like people who have died and their bodies are left on the street, and no one able to give them a safe and dignified burial.
Goodness me. Have you lost contact with your crews there now?
So of our staff, a number of them were able to leave in the last week, but we still have 6 staff members who we don't have contact with, who we don't know. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know if they're still alive, or what their living condition is like in Mariupol.
They're obviously, look, the people who've been able to get out so there is now a migration of refugees in Ukraine and trying to get across the border. The people who are in there are besieged and stuck. I'm guessing in some of those areas now, hospitals, medical facilities, that system would have just collapsed by now.
It has. In the areas that are besieged, the system is almost at complete collapse. You still have some health professionals who are trying their hardest to provide care, but it's extremely difficult when the structure that they're working in is not necessarily fully intact. They don't have a continued supply of drugs, of medical consumables to be able to treat people. And then on top of that, it's not just that the city itself is besieged, but the ability for people within that city to move around and get to these health facilities is compromised. They don't necessarily have that.
It's often forgotten in war and conflict, but to your earlier point, the people who were already facing health difficulties, I'm thinking of young kids facing, life-saving cancer treatments and all sorts of treatments. I mean, that must just now be in chaos, and lives are being lost just because those supplies are cut off, those hospitals are collapsing, and that's a heartbreaking scenario as well.
Indeed, it's horrible. We have a number of different hospitals trying to reach out to us for cancer care medication, for diabetes, for hypertension. We see people who have been able to flee either inside Ukraine or have come out to one of the countries surrounding Ukraine that no longer have their medication, and they're seeing exacerbation of their illness because of that. And it's very difficult for them because they don't know what's going to come next. No. They don't know how long that they are going to have to live like this. Is it going to be a week? Is it going to be a month? Are we looking at months where this uncertainty will be?
Just briefly, logistically, have you got a supply chain of experienced staff and supplies? So if people can get out of some of those areas of conflict, there are people waiting in some safer parts to help them. Is that how it works, or are you trying to get people into these areas to help them directly?
So we are extraordinarily lucky as Médecins Sans Frontières. We have both a supply chain of medical materials and drugs that are able to come into the country, and also people. So we have teams in the east right now, unfortunately no longer in places like Mariupol, but in other cities close where the population that is displaced can access healthcare together with the Ministry of Health. And we also have teams in all of the surrounding countries for those who cross the border to seek refuge and need healthcare as well.
Anything we can help directly? I mean, donating to Médecins Sans Frontières or directly, or what are you asking for at the moment?
I think if anyone wants to help, then donating to Médecins Sans Frontières or any of a number of groups that are able to run operations in Ukraine, that really is the most important thing.
All right, well, we'll put that on our social media as well and try and give that a bit of a push. Anything we can do to help to support what you and your medical teams are doing in the country is very much needed. Kate White, so lovely to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And that's the latest from Ukraine and a focus on Putin's power. Thanks for your company. I'm Michael Usher. Goodbye.